people who are there to train, say, the South Vietnamese to fight, that sort of thing. But as we get deeper into the war, starting in 1964, with Lyndon B. Johnson as president, things begin to escalate dramatically, and we start to increasingly send soldiers into Vietnam. And many of them have been raised on the stories that, you know, their parents tell about fighting in World War II. And so they see it as a noble calling and so forth, and they don't know what to expect. And so they walk into what is ultimately a very different conflict than the one that they've been exposed to before. I'm going to jump back one more time for a minute. Right where? Here, 57.
October 2nd, I had returned from Vietnam. At that time, we had 16,000 military advisors. I recommended to President Kennedy and to the Security Council that we establish a plan and an objective of removing all of them within 2 years.
The advantage of anybody taking them out is say to the Congress and the people that we do have a plan for reducing the exposure of U.S. combat personnel. My recommendation about it is that war doesn't continue to go well. It looks like we were overly optimistic. We can either way to get out of Vietnam. That's the way of doing it.
Kennedy announced we were going to pull out all of our military advisors by the end of '65. We're going to take 1,000 out at the end of '63, and we did. But there was the coup in South Vietnam. Diem was overthrown, and he and his brother were killed.
These are the leaders of South Vietnam.
Was present with the president when together we received information of that coup. I have never seen him more upset. He totally blanched. President Kennedy and I had tremendous problems with Diem, but my God, he was the authority, he was the head of state, and he was overthrown by a military coup. And Kennedy knew, and I knew, that to some degree, the US government was responsible for that. I was in my office in the Pentagon when the telephone rang, and it was Bobby. The president had been shot in Dallas. Perhaps 45 minutes later, Bobby called again and said the president was dead. Jackie would like me to come out to the hospital. We took the body to the White House about whatever it was, 4 a.m. and called the superintendent of Arlington Cemetery. And he and I walked over those grounds. They're hauntingly beautiful grounds. White crosses, row and row. And finally, I thought I found the exact spot, the most beautiful spot in the cemetery. I called Jackie at the White House and asked her to come out there, and she immediately accepted it. And that's where the president is buried today. A Park Service ranger came up to me and said that he had escorted President Kennedy on a tour of those grounds a few weeks before. And Kennedy said That was the most beautiful spot in Washington. That's where he's buried.
I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
So Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. I want to talk about Lyndon for just a second here because I am fascinated by the man. This is a picture of him being sworn in. This is after Kennedy has been shot. This is on Air Force One. So he gets sworn in immediately. Jackie Kennedy there by his side. Lady Bird Johnson, his wife, right over here. And this is him being sworn in as President of the United States in the middle of this crisis. So who was Lyndon B. Johnson, right? Like, who was this guy? I pray that all of you have heard something about John Kennedy. But most people, I say Lyndon B. Johnson, there's no association whatsoever with him. And it's important to understand who he was to a certain extent. First of all, he was a kid who, when he was a kid, looked exactly like he did when he was an adult. Just want to emphasize this fact real quickly here, okay? All right? I've never seen a kid who looked more like, anyway. He's a goofy-looking guy, right? He was a big, tall guy when he grew up. And his father had been a state legislator out in the Texas Hill Country. Does anybody know where the Texas Hill Country is? Ever been there? Do I have anybody from the Texas Hill Country? Johnson City, that area? All right, well, Johnson City is named after his family. And at this time, it was an incredibly poor rural area. When we talk about the Grange, back when we were talking about the populist movement, the progressive era, the Grange was really active in this area, and it was a lot of poor farmers who had been attracted to the area because it seemed like a really fertile, nice place. But actually the streams and everything that were in it were a result of the fact that it had, for thousands of years, burned down over and over again, and so you had this fertile soil. But once you got rid of that fertile soil, especially by growing something really demanding like cotton, it was gone, right? This was not a place where the soil regenerated quickly. And so most of them found themselves on very poor farms. Well, his father was a beloved state legislature. I told you a while ago about how corrupt the Texas state legislature was. His father was a beloved legislator because he was a guy, kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, who fought for the common man, right? He fought the railroad trusts, he fought the oil trusts. He was one of these guys who was unwilling to take bribes and so forth. He was a fighter. And yet, what that meant was that when he was finally defeated from office, unlike all his corrupt colleagues who, when they finally left the legislature, got sort of a cushy job with the railroads as sort of a thank you gift for representing their interests, his father just sank into deep poverty. And Lyndon B. Johnson resented his father for the rest of his life for this failure. Right? Johnson learned two things. He knew one thing about himself. Human beings are complex, but there's one critical thing to understand about Lyndon B. Johnson, and that was that he wanted to be loved by other people. He wanted other people to love him and to respect him, and he knew that the best way to do that was to do favors for them and to help them, but he also adopted a approach to politics that was the opposite of his father's. Right? That is to say that he had no grounding principles. He just did whatever he thought would get him elected. And he borrowed something from his father. His father was famous for talking to people, and he would get right in their face. I'm not going to do it. I will get as close as I can. But he would get right in your face and talk to you in a very friendly way. Johnson combined that with friendly and aggressive, and he would switch back and forth between them with seemingly at random, so that you never knew what was going to happen when. And I have a few examples of it. This is what's called the Johnson treatment right here. You can see this guy up here in the top left corner that he's talking to is literally leaning back over a table in order to get Johnson out of his personal space. Look how close these guys are together, right? I mean, their noses are virtually touching. This guy, he's leaning back so far, I can't believe he's not falling over, right? And then there's the hollering, right, which is also important to note. So Johnson was a very influential, what we would call retail politician. He worked harder than anybody else, and he was willing to do whatever it took. So real quick anecdote, just to help understand him. Back in the 40s, when he was a young congressman, the Democratic Party was in trouble because FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was running for a third term, and he was probably going to win, but the American people were like, well, we'll give you a third term, which we've never done for anybody else, but we're going to punish everybody else in your party for it. So they thought that the Republicans were going to take over Congress as a result of that election, even though the Democrats would win the presidency. But Johnson said, I can get you enough money to win. But the key is, don't ask me how I got it, okay? And so Johnson had tapped into a group, the wildcat oil industry, which were not big oil, but guys who would go out and, you know, just kind of on their own drill a well and become super wealthy. Well, they were starting to face regulation. And so Johnson said to these wildcat oil tycoons, he said, I will protect your interests. And he said to the Democratic Party, I will get you reelected. Don't ask me how I do it to either party. So he would take money, illegally launder it over to the Democratic Party, and the Democrats spent far more, and when I say far more, I mean like 50 times more in that election than they had ever spent before, right? And it was all this oil money that Johnson was able to launder through his office to the Democratic Party. And that, in effect, created the modern election campaign. That's why we have the campaigns that we have where people spend tons of money. But this was Johnson, right? And so this motivation, these ideas are important to understand about him. Okay, I want to get to this experience because I think it's key. So let's get over to really talking about what happened. So there's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which occurs, and that's kind of what, for Johnson, creates the escalation of the war. Johnson, we believe that one of our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, just off the coast of Vietnam, is attacked by a Viet Cong ship. Later on, we're able to establish that it probably didn't actually happen, but it is justification for a mandate from Congress to increase the number of soldiers, and the number of soldiers going into Vietnam begins to escalate dramatically. And we start to use the draft system, right? Which means you didn't enlist, right? But your number came up and we're sending you, right? Whether you want to or not. And young men by the thousands are drafted and sent to Vietnam. And you see, if we went through the numbers during these first few months, it may show a couple of them, but in these first few months, it would be, we send over 10,000 soldiers, 20,000 soldiers, 30,000 soldiers. As we start to get into 65, we're talking about sending over 200,000 soldiers. 300,000 soldiers, right? Until we have massive, massive quantities of men on the ground fighting in Vietnam. Much of the warfare was extremely difficult because you did not know who the enemy was, because this wasn't like a traditional war. This was guerrilla warfare. You're in the South, and so theoretically, you're in, right, like friendly territory, except that there are people all around you who actually want the South to be communist. And so the farmer who you see in the field may be the guy who shoots you later that night, right? And so it leads to this real panic and fear and everything that's associated with it. But I'm gonna show you guys this. This is one of the first major actual battles. Battles were rare in Vietnam. mostly what we had were firefights. You would go through the jungle, you'd encounter some Viet Cong, they'd shoot at you, you had no idea where they were at, you'd return fire, they'd disappear, you'd move on. But this one shows an actual battle, and again, this is in the voices, with the footage of the people actually there at the time. And the main character that they show in this is a reporter who had volunteered. He wanted to be there, and so he had volunteered and pushed and pushed and pushed to be a part of this group that goes into this battle.
God, you can feel the excitement building. We finally got intelligence that 200 NVA soldiers are in the hills of the Chupang Mountain.
UPI reporter Joe Galloway has joined up with the 1st Cavalry, one of the Army's new air-mobile assault units. After months of fighting small, frustrating skirmishes, U.S. forces are preparing to launch their first major assault against 200 North Vietnamese soldiers using an experimental new tactic, air mobility.
So this is a cavalry unit. Historically, what is a cavalry unit? Horses, and now they're helicopters, okay?
Equipped with UH-1 Hueys, the 1st Cavalry is designed to insert soldiers into combat using helicopters. For this encounter, they will make their first attempt at inserting a force of 450 Americans to fight the 200 NVA. But as the men prepare for battle, a potentially serious problem weighs on the mind of the commanding officer, Colonel Hal Moore. The spot where they will land, a small clearing designated Landing Zone X-Ray, was chosen because of its close proximity to the enemy. It is too small, however, to land more than 8 helicopters at a time. With each chopper able to carry only about 6 men, it will take several hours to get all 450 soldiers on the ground.
Any commander's fear in a case like that, if you land and you've only got a few of your troops, less than 100, and the enemy comes on you, you're in a bind. If you go down, the LZ is the landing zone is closed, and whoever's in there dies.
At 10:19 a.m., Firebase Falcon, 5 miles from the landing zone, lets loose a vicious barrage of artillery into the enemy positions. The 28-minute onslaught is meant to clear the LZ so the helicopters can land safely. At 10:35 a.m., the first U.S. choppers lift off and begin the 13-minute flight to the landing zone. Miles outside of LZ X-Ray, the choppers drop to treetop level. In front of them lays a landscape of smoke and exploding U.S. ordnance. The barrage is intricately timed to stop just 1 minute before the soldiers hit the ground. If the timing is off by even a few seconds, they will risk being hit with their own artillery.
I was staying close to the tent where the radios were.
Radios were at brigade headquarters, so that I could hear if anything started happening.
This is 6-5, have negative contact, all the birds have belong to us.
Now another 200!
Bravo Company is sweeping the area around the LZ. So far, all is quiet. Already the choppers are delivering the second load of soldiers. Everything seems to be going according to plan. Until 11:15 a.m. Bravo's 1st platoon captures a single, unarmed NVA soldier. He's immediately taken to the command center for interrogation. At 11:20, the prisoner makes an incredible revelation. He tells the interpreter there are 3 full battalions of North Vietnamese soldiers on the mountain, and that all of them want very much to kill Americans. It's unbelievable. 3 battalions, that's almost 1,600 soldiers. No one can believe what they're hearing. We've got less than 200 men on the ground, meaning we're outnumbered 8-1.
Roger, say again.
Within minutes, U.S. and North Vietnamese forces are locked in vicious combat. While the men on the ground desperately attempt to keep the North Vietnamese from overrunning the LZ, the pilots of the 1st Cavalry continue to ferry in the remainder of the 450 men amid a vicious torrent of enemy bullets and rockets.
There are things about battle that movies cannot teach you, and that is the true
Pay attention.
horrendous noise of battle. Bullets cracking, bombs landing, artillery shells exploding, people screaming. It's just a cacophony that's almost deafening.
After nearly 8 hours of battle, casualties are mounting and supplies are running low. But with night fast approaching, all further landings must be called off until dawn. The 450 battered Americans are on their own and will have to survive the night in the face of an overwhelming enemy.
Last night, the enemy launched several small attacks against our lines. The dead still lay where they were killed. It's too dangerous to try and move them.
Joe Galloway is the only correspondent at Landing Zone X-Ray. Of the 450 soldiers on the battlefield, 85 are already dead or wounded. Those still alive are desperately in need of ammunition and supplies.
Word is that reinforcements are going to try and land a few miles away and try to fight their way over to us. God, I hope they make it.
I'm going to pause it again. There's a factor that I always forget to mention, which is that having grown up as we have with movies and war movies, it's easy to look at this and go, oh, I've seen this before. I've seen movies like this before. This is not a movie, okay? All right, like reframe your brain for a minute. These are actual human beings fighting and dying.
At the base of the Chupong Mountain are nearly 1,600 enemy soldiers. A few hundred yards in front of them stands only a thin line of Americans, pounded and exhausted from nearly 24 hours of constant fighting. The enemy's sporadic attacks during the night were to determine the most vulnerable points in the U.S. lines. Now they know the best way to breach them, and they are preparing to put this knowledge to use.
Yeah, down that way, and especially all the compounds, all the entrances and stuff.
Yeah,
3,500 count. In the same altitude as the rest.
At 6:50 a.m., 200 NVA soldiers hit C Company's 1st and 2nd platoons. Company Commander Bob Edwards is shot through the shoulder, leading his men in a counterattack. His XO, Lieutenant Arrington, runs up to assist, but within minutes he is also shot, right through the chest. The enemy is within 75 yards of their lines. Some of the men are down to hand-to-hand combat. At 7:15, NVA soldiers hit Delta Company, right where they connect with Charlie Company. The line is starting to break down. Enemy's bullets are passing right
through the command area where we were sitting. And I just fell over on my belly and got as flat as I could. And finally, Colonel Moore looked at the Air Force liaison, Lieutenant Charlie Hastings. Moore looks at him and says, "Call Broken Arrow." Broken Arrow was a code at that time, meant that an American unit was in dire danger of being overrun and wiped out. And when that call was given, every available fighter bomber in Vietnam diverted to that place to deliver their bombs. It was about then that I heard Colonel Moore yelling, "Get him off of us, Charlie! Get him off of us! Call that SOB off!" And I looked up, and there are two F-100 Super Sabre jets like this. They're coming directly at us. Lead plane has already punched the pickle switch and turned loose canisters of napalm.
What is napalm? Yeah, it's like jelly, right? But it ignites. And so if you can imagine getting something sticky on you that's also on fire, that's what napalm does. And so it sticks to you while it burns.
Hal was trying to stop the second guy from dumping his on us. But unfortunately for 2 or 3 engineer demolition guys, they were right in the path. Flame, I could see these 2 men dancing and screaming. And someone yelled, "Get this man's feet!" And I reached down and picked him up, and his boots crumbled. The flesh on his ankles just peeled off. I could feel the ankle bone in the palm of my hands. And and we carried him over to where the wounded were. It was a young specialist named Jim Nakayama out of Rigby, Idaho. Married. Wife had a baby that week. He died 2 days later. That boy is my nightmare.
There's a wonderful book about Vietnam called The Things They Carried. And I forget the guy's first name. O'Brien is his last name. But if you ever want to read a book about Vietnam, I recommend The Things They Carried. But it's a story that talks about everything that Vietnam veterans carried with them during the war and then after, right? And it's actually short stories, sort of fictionalized accounts of real things that happened. But part of what comes out of this is a lot of protest, a growing sense of why on earth are we fighting this war, where these people are fighting for freedom the same way we did once upon a time. The peace movement, right? One of its most famous images right here, this young girl sticking a flower into the barrel of these guns, of these young National Guard soldiers there to try and keep protests under control. Young black soldiers who, had been discriminated against in the United States, African Americans were heavily drafted during Vietnam War, and basically, very symbolic. What argument do I have with them? And then some of the most symbolic protests were ones like these, where soldiers would go and take the medals that they had won during Vietnam and throw them away. Just have a thing where they would publicly throw them, usually onto the steps of the Capitol building. And you can see in this young man's face a lot of different emotions there. We're out of time, but don't go anywhere for just a second. Just hold on for a second. Okay, so on Tuesday of next week, we are going to have a review for the final. On Thursday of next week, because originally the Civic Innovation Summit had been scheduled for that day, it says that we don't have class, but we will have class that day in order to sort of wrap up, catch up things, and